So far we have seen a little bit about what is intelligence, we have tried to, and try to see what is the goal in AI, which is to build intelligent agents. Uh, but this quest for building intelligent agents and this quest for understanding intelligence, both they go back a long way, and we will look a little bit into the European history and see what are the roots from which this kind of thinking has come here. So, we go back a few hundred years ago to Galileo Galilei. He said, and this was a book he published in 1623, he says that I think that taste, odors, colors and so on are no more than mere names so far as the object in which we locate them are concerned. So, if we say that a rose is smelling sweet, he is saying it is not the property of the rose, this sweetness, that it resides in our consciousness. Hence, if the living creature were removed, all these qualities would be wiped out, away and annihilated. So, he says that it is the way that we see the world that we give names to things like taste and odor and color and so on. It is not the sweetness is not a property of the rose, the sweetness of the smell of rose is only with respect to us, because we find it sweet essentially. Likewise, if you if you say that a chocolate is not very sweet, that is because we sense it like that. So, he says that these are things which are happening to us essentially, and uh, if you look at it from the chemical point of view, then smell that we get from somewhere are basically chemical compounds which are floating in the air. They come and hit our nose somewhere inside the nose and create this sensation of having that particular smell. So, he is saying that all these things they reside in our consciousness, and this is Galileo saying this quite some time ago. He also said that philosophy is written in. So, when they say philosophy in those times, it used to include all sciences essentially. So, these people were all philosophers essentially. I mean, unlike in current day times when we have computer scientists and we have mathematicians and we have artists, these people were doing everything and everything was called philosophy. And he said that philosophy is written in this grand book, the universe. It is written in the language of mathematics, and its characters are triangles, circles and other geometric figures. Okay. Now, you must remember that at the time of Galileo, uh, symbolic mathematics, some algebra for example, was not there essentially. It came much later. For Galileo, mathematics had things like numbers and they had geometry essentially. And he showed that geometry could be used to represent and reason about motion. So, his argument was, for example, if you remember from your school days equation that u is equal to at plus uh, u is equal to v is equal to u plus half at square, then he would draw a triangle and say that this is time, and if that is the acceleration, so this is acceleration to time and this is time, and the area of this triangle is half at square. And so, he would use geometry to reason about motion. So, we understand, so our laws of motion that we talk about in algebraic terms, Galileo himself talked in geometric terms essentially. So, for him it was the area of the triangle essentially. Sorry, maybe it is not like this, it is like this. 80 is here. So, the vertical axis represents the speed and the horizontal axis represents the time essentially. Then we go to the British philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who Hogeland calls as the grandfather of AI, who put forward the view that thinking is the manipulation of symbols. All this is happening at a time where from our perspective, some of these things were kind of mysteries. In fact, people didn't even have the notion of the mind, as we will see later. The notion of the mind itself came later. Galileo had said that reality is mathematical in the sense that everything is made up of particles, and our sensing of smell or taste is how we react to those particles. Hobbes extended this notion to say that thought too was made up of or was expressed in particles which the thinker manipulated essentially. So, he was influenced by Galileo. Just as geometry could represent motion, thinking could be done by manipulation of mental symbols. So, he was one of the first to put forward this idea. That is why Hogeland calls him the grandfather of AI. Hobbes says that by reasoning I understand computation. Now, we must understand what he means by this. When he says computation, it is nothing to do with computers as we know. In his time, computers were people who were good at mathematics, who were good at arithmetic, and they would do all the accounting and the calculations and things like that, and they were called computers essentially. And what they did was called computation, which was basically arithmetic. So, he says by reasoning I understand computation in that sense, and to compute is to collect the sum of many things added together at the same time, or to know the remainder when one thing is been taken away from another. You can see he is talking about arithmetic. To reason therefore is the same as to add or to subtract essentially. So, he is associating with arithmetic with thinking essentially. Now, if you have had the opportunity to read these comics by Calvin and Hobbes, then you should know that Bill Watterson, who was the author of these comics, he named the character Hobbes after Thomas Hobbes. And Calvin also, as you can imagine, was another scientist. So, Calvin and Hobbes were philosopher scientists from earlier ages essentially. Then came Rene Descartes, who of course, we all know Cartesian coordinates are named after him. He said animals are wonderful machines, human beings are too, except that they possess a mind. He also took forward the idea that thoughts is equal to symbols. Just as Galileo said that motion could be represented by geometry, Descartes showed that geometry could be represented by algebra. So, you could write for example, the equation of a straight line. Descartes said that everything is applied maths, even thought, and he said that thought themselves are symbolic representations. According to him, a symbol and what it symbolizes are two different things. Of course, we accept that as now, but this is the idea that Descartes introduced, and he was talking in terms of thinking essentially. So, a symbol is something which can be manipulated, which is associated with thinking. What it symbolizes is the subject of thought, which is what is happening in the real world. So, according to Descartes, mind was the instrument of thinking or the means of thinking, and what it was thinking about was something totally different, which is the subject of thought, which is the world essentially. So, he says what the mind is doing, and mind is of course thinking about the world, but mind and the world are different things essentially. So, they are not equal essentially. The question of course then people ask, what makes a notation suitable to symbolize something? What makes a suitable notation actually symbolize something? How can thought and matter interact? And this is where this mind body dualism came into picture, that people started saying that if thinking is mental symbols and the world is physical in nature, which is the body in some sense. So, how do the mind and body interact? So, for example, if I think about raising my hand, then how does my physical hand get influenced by the thought? Because physics was about matter, and matter required force and things like that, whereas mind was only about symbols essentially. How can the mental world or the world of symbols interact with the physical world? How can the mind influence body, and maybe vice versa also? So, that was called the mind body problem, and that is a paradox of mechanical reason, which other people have also said, that if reasoning is the manipulation of meaningful symbols according to rational rules, then who is manipulating the symbols? That is a question which Rene Descartes could never answer, and the question was, it can be either mechanical or meaningful, but how can it be both? Remember, mechanical is something which happens by automatic rules and things like that. How can a mechanical manipulator pay attention to meaning essentially? Hmm? So, people used to kind of, his opponents used to kind of make fun of him and say that, oh, there must be the faculty of will, or there must be the transcendental ego, or something called the homunculus. We will see the homunculus or the little man. So, people said, is there a little man inside your head who is manipulating the symbols that you call as thinking? And of course, he did not have answers to those questions. Now, if you are really interested in some of these questions as to how can a mind work, you should look at some of the books by Douglas Hofstadter, who was a physicist turned into an AI researcher. His first book, Gödel Escherbach, got a Pulitzer Prize in 1980 or something like that. But he wrote also interesting books. Along with Daniel Dennett, he wrote the book called The Mind's Eye, where the eye is the reference to the self essentially. And then of course, he expounded upon that, and very insightful book, his most recent book called I Am a Strange Loop essentially. This notion of being able to refer to yourself, how can it happen in the mind essentially. So, let us go from minds to bodies. So, there was a lot of artificial people in Western mythology. For example, in Homer's Iliad, Hephaestus creates this Talos, a man of bronze, to patrol the beaches of Crete. And he also created Pandora, who was commissioned by Zeus to punish mankind for accepting the gift of fire. And Pandora, if you have heard the stories of Pandora and the casket, she got overcome by curiosity and opens the infamous casket. So, these are artificial people that we are talking about. This desire to create, or this thought of creating artificial people has been there for a long time. Then Pygmalion, we have already said that Bernard Shaw wrote a play called Pygmalion. And according to Western mythology, Pygmalion was disappointed by real women and created somebody called Galatea in ivory, and the goddess Aphrodite obliges him by breathing life into Galatea. So, the talk of creating people. Then Daedalus is credited with creating lifelike statues that wheezed and blinked and scuttled about, impressing everyone. Daedalus was also known for trying to fly by attaching wings to his shoulders. Then Pope Sylvester II, and you can see this is a decade, a millennium ago, is said to have made a statue with a talking head with limited vocabulary and a penchant for predicting the future. So, we have seen how we have astrologers, they are sitting with parrots who can tell you your future and things like that, they pick a card and things like that. All these kind of ideas have always existed, that we can create artificial things which can do intelligent things for us. And so, on being asked a query about the future, it would simply reply yes or no essentially. This is a bit of mythology. Then there was this Paracelsus, a prominent physician who invented what is called as a homunculus, or a little man. So, remember that people were mocking Rene Descartes, that there is a homunculus sitting in your head and so on. So, Paracelsus says that we shall be like gods, we shall duplicate God's greatest miracle, the creation of man essentially. So, the Western worldview of course is that God created man. Then there was the Jewish Rabbi Judah Loew, who is reported to have sculpted a living man of clay named Golem. So, in Jewish folklore, a golem is an animated anthropomorphic being created entirely from inanimate matter. So, this is all folklore, but then we talk about real mechanisms. In 1802, this Emperor Harun al-Rashid is said to have presented Emperor of France with an elaborate clock which sent out a dozen cavaliers from a dozen windows each noon and sent them back again. And by the middle of the 14th century, large elaborate clockwork appeared in Europe everywhere, Strasbourg, Nuremberg, Lübeck and so on, where you could see these kind of animated clockwork statues essentially. The Archbishop of Salzburg, he built a working model of a complete miniature town, all operated by water power from a nearby stream. So, these are all real mechanisms which existed. Then a group of Arab astrologers is credited with constructing a thinking machine called the Jaiza, which was designed to generate ideas by mechanical means with the help of a technique called the technique of breaking down, or al-jabr in Arabic, from which we get the word algebra. And by combining number values associated with these letters and categories, new paths and insights could be thought of or created. So, these were like concentric circles which could be rotated, and combinations meant certain things and so on. So, the Jaiza caught the attention of the Catalonian missionary Raymond Lull, who decided to build a Christian version which he called the Ars Magna, and his goal was to bring reason to bear on all subjects, and in this way arrive at the truth without the trouble of thinking or fact finding. So, they are still imagining thinking machines, machines which will help them think. So, logic for example was invented to resolve disputes between people essentially. So, if you know something, then what else can you prove essentially? And this desire to create thinking machines was there even then. Then in the 18th century, Vaucanson, a French inventor, he created several mechanical automata, and the most famous of this was this duck, which according to literature eats, drinks, eats, quacks, splashes about on water and digests his food essentially. So, you can imagine that this duck was immersed in water up to here, and the rest of the machinery was below the water, and then it would behave almost like a duck essentially. But of course, it did not have the ability to actually digest food, even though it appeared to do so. And Vaucanson hopes that one day such a machine would be invented which would actually digest food essentially. Then one of the most famous examples is this von Kempelen's chess playing Turk. So, if you know this, nowadays people use the notion of a Turk to do crowdsourcing of work or money or whatever. So, the mechanical Turk, the name came from here, from Kempelen. He constructed and unveiled in 1770 a chess playing robot, so to speak, and it could play very good chess as well as it could perform the knight's tour. So, knight's tour, if you know, is how can a knight move over the entire chessboard, visiting every square exactly once. But this was a chess playing robot, and it played very well, and it impressed a lot of people, and it defeated people like Napoleon and Benjamin Franklin and so on. But it turned out that it was not really a robot, that there was a diminutive man hidden inside this box, and this was the kind of a robot, or what looked like a robot. It was controlled inside by a man here. So, it was not as if there is a chess playing machine there. But this idea of making machines do things was very attractive, and Pascal, who we know from our physics, invented the mechanical calculator using something called lantern gears in 1642, and he did a lot of prototypes and things like that. Eventually, he built a machine which many people call as the Pascaline, which could add and subtract two numbers directly and multiply and divide them by repeated repeated addition and multiplication. So, this was a machine which worked, and he sold about 20 machines, but the cost and complexity of this machine Pascaline was so high that he had to cease production. After that came Leibniz, Gottfried Leibniz. He was a German mathematician and a philosopher, and he started to work on his own calculator after Pascal's death, essentially. So, he invented this Leibniz wheel of the step drum, which is worthy of uh, attention, which was used for 3 centuries after that, till the middle of the last century, essentially. So, what does this drum do? As you can see on the drum, there are these pieces sticking out of different length, and the drum is rotating, and there is a gear which can be driven by that, essentially. So, you can see that by sliding this rod up and down in this direction, you could measure out different number of teeth that it would rotate by. So, for example, if it was at this end, it would rotate only little bit, but if it was at this end, then it would rotate many number of times. So, this was a mechanism for counting, you can see, for representing numbers and dealing with numbers essentially. So, number 1 would be somewhere here, and maybe number 9 would be somewhere on the other end, and by moving this red rod up and down, you could manipulate this whole thing. And so, he built this machine, calculating machine, which is called the stepped reckoner. Was a digital mechanical calculator, and it could perform multiplication again by repeated addition and division by repeated subtraction with 8 digit numbers, essentially. Then there was a further improvement upon that. We will come to that in a moment, but Leibniz was also interested in logic, and he said, or he believed, that much of human reasoning could be reduced to calculations of a sort. So, this is the same idea which Hobbes had said and Descartes had said and things like that, that manipulating symbols in a meaningful fashion. But Leibniz said that we could use that to do logic. So, calculation that could resolve many differences in opinion. So, that is what logic, one of the goals of developing logic was. And he says that the only way to rectify our reasonings is to make them as tangible as those of mathematicians, so that we can find an error at a glance, and when there are disputes among persons, we can simply say, let us calculate without further ado and see who is right. So, that is trying to formalize things and resolve disputes. That is one of the reasons why logic was developed. So, anyway, coming back to calculating machines, the arithmometer was developed by Thomas D. Colmar in 19th century, and its sturdy design made it a key player in the form of human computers to calculating machines that took place during the second half of the 19th century. So, almost up to 100 years ago, these things were used, I think. So, when we talk about computers, we talk about Charles Babbage, of course. He was a mathematician, philosopher, inventor, mechanical engineer, who is best known for originating the concept of a programmable computer. So, as a child, he was impressed by the kind of automata. We have said that Europe was full of such automata, and there was this man called Merlin who was demonstrating some automata, and Babbage describes them as: one walked, used an eyeglass occasionally, and bowed frequently. Her motions were singularly graceful. The other was a dancer, full of imagination and irresistible. So, he is ascribing imagination to um, the physical statue. So, he began work on what is called as a difference engine, made up of and the idea was to compute polynomial functions. So, he is moving beyond the work of Colmar and Leibniz and Pascal. His difference engine could calculate a series of values automatically, and it had 25,000 parts, weighed about 13,000 kilos, and was a huge machine, about 8 feet tall essentially. So, here is a picture of a difference engine created by his son using the parts he found in his lab. And here is another picture of the difference engine, which is now in the London's Science Museum. This thing, it's a working engine, and if you go to YouTube, for example, and search for the difference engine, you will see videos of this machine actually working. So, we have all these gears worrying about the place, and actually what they are doing is arithmetic of some sort essentially, which is itself a quite an interesting phenomena. Now comes the idea of these looms, these jacquard looms. So, if you were to travel in many parts of India, for example, if you go to Himachal, you would see shawls being made, and if you go to Kanjivaram or Banaras, you would see saris being woven. And what they did was they used punched cards to weave different patterns essentially. So, these are the punch cards we are talking about here, and essentially they controlled this machine that you can see on the right and pulled in different threads to create different kinds of patterns. Now, this idea of punch cards was uh, carried forward right through to till the middle of the last century, and some of the first computers that we used punch cards as for input. So, remember that the idea of a computer is a programmable machine, and what's these punch cards? In this case of looms, they were representing patterns, but in the case of computers, they represented programs. And I can tell you that when I was a student at IIT Bombay many years ago, we used this punched cards to enter programs into the machine. So, each card represented one line in the program, and we used to have a machine which would allow us to type that line, and it would punch holes into this card, and then we would take a deck of cards like this and give it to the operator, and next day we would go and collect our results. So, as a memento, I will give this to Rishabh and Krishnan. You can take it after this class and keep it. There was a time when computing was done using the very same punch cards which are used in the textile industry even now. And finally, the analytic engine, that was what is equivalent to a general purpose computer designed by Charles Babbage. He could never actually construct one, and the picture that you see is a trial model built by Babbage as displayed in the trial model of the part of an analytic engine built by Babbage. I don't know whether this was built by Babbage or somebody else built using his design, but it's on display in the Science Museum in London. The thing about the analytic engine was that it was the first general purpose computer. It had an arithmetic and logic unit, it had control flow, it had conditional branching and loops and integrated memory, and it was the first general purpose computer which is in some sense Turing complete. Basically, by Turing complete we mean that anything that a Turing machine can do, this machine could have also done essentially. So, of course, all our machines are Turing, all our computers are Turing complete machines, but this was the first one which was designed to be, and it was a fully mechanical in the sense made up of metal parts, gears and things like that. So, associated with Charles Babbage was Augusta Ada Byron, also known as Augusta Ada King. She was the daughter of Lord Byron, who was a poet, but Ada herself was more inclined towards mathematics, and she had a close association with Charles Babbage, and she did a lot of work on his analytical engine. So, her notes on the engine include what is recognized as the first algorithm intended to be processed by a machine, and because of this she is often considered to be the world's first programmer. And the programming language Ada, which is still used in many parts in the US, for example, by the Department of Defense, is named after her essentially. She was also one of the first persons to realize that machines could go beyond number crunching. So, remember that what Pascal did was he wanted to add two numbers. Leibniz said we will add two 8 digit numbers. Then Pascaline, no, then this thing, uh, machine by Colmar, it could do repeated multiplication and addition, and Leibniz and all that stuff. What Ada Lovelace realized was that machines could do things beyond numbers essentially, and she says that the analytic engine might act upon other things besides number, were objects found whose mutual fundamental relations could be expressed by those of the abstract science of operations, basically relations between things, and which should also be susceptible to adaptations to the action of the operating notation and the mechanism of the engine. So, in some sense, physical symbols that could be manipulated by a physical machine essentially. They do not have to be just numbers, they could have been other things. She even went so far as to say that supposing for instance the fundamental relations of pitched sounds. So, the notes of music for example, in the science of harmony and of musical composition were susceptible to such expression and adaptations, the engine might compose elaborate and scientific pieces of music of any degree of complexity or extent. So, you can imagine that here was these two people, Babbage and Ada Lovelace. They had just kind of invented the first physical computer, a general purpose computer, and she is already imagining that it could do things like computing, composing music, and in some sense do AI, because AI you are capturing relations between different things and making inferences. But the first really realization of the general purpose computer was ENIAC, uh, which you can see is a room full of electronic circuits, more than 17,000 vacuum tubes, more than 7,000 crystal diodes, and so on and so forth, weighing 27 tons and so on, consumed 150 kilowatts of power. This was the first electronic computer that was built, and its computing power was less than what you hold in your mobile phone in your hand, essentially, much less than that essentially. So, we will stop with history here and then move on to a little bit about what is happening in the world of AI